Okay, as folks still continue to stream into the room, I want to welcome everybody. My name is Chelsea Lake. I'm on the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and welcome to P&P Live. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the Q&A feature, which is located along the bottom of the screen, and post a question. That's the best place for questions. We also have the chat open, but it's easier if we have all the questions in one place. And Susan has graciously agreed to pop those open. So please keep them coming. Also at any point during the event, I'm going to be dropping the link to On Animals in the chat. That'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website where you can purchase the book. We are delighted to offer closed captioning at this event. Just look for the live transcripts option, which is also along the menu across the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Susan Orlean has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1992. She is the New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, including the library book, Rin Tin Tin, Saturday Night, and The Orchid Thief, which was made into the Academy Award-winning movie adaptation. Susan writes, quote, "How we interact with animals has preoccupied philosophers, poets, and naturalists for ages. Since the age of 6, when she wrote and illustrated a book called Herbert the Near-Sighted Pigeon, she's been drawn to stories about how we live with animals and how they abide by us. Now, in On Animals, she examines animal-human relationships through the compelling tales she has written over the course of her celebrated career." So it's now my pleasure to turn the screen over to you, Susan. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And I want to say huge thanks to Politics and Prose and to all the independent bookstores that make being a writer a pleasure. They support us immeasurably, and I wish I were there. I have loved my visits to Washington and being able to spend time at Politics and Prose. So I'm missing that very much, but I'm hoping in the near future that will happen again. And thank you all for being here and joining me from my backyard. I guess that has some advantages, and my dogs usually make an appearance at some point during the evening, which would be very appropriate. I want to talk to you about this book and about how it came about. I'm going to start by reading a short few sections, and I'd love to encourage you to ask questions because I love answering them. And we have the opportunity for that tonight with the Q&A bubble that you can ask your questions in. So this is from the beginning of the book, a chapter called Animalish. Even before the cats, before the dogs, before the chickens, before the turkeys, before the ducks and the guinea fowl and the betta fish and the black Angus cattle, I was always a little animalish. I don't just mean as a child, since all children love animals and come by being animalish quite naturally. I don't just mean as a young girl, that golden moment when I, like millions of young girls throughout human history, fell into an adolescent swoon over horses and, to a lesser degree, puppies. I mean that somehow or other, in whatever kind of life I happen to be leading, animals have always been my style. They have been a part of my life even when I didn't have any animals. And when I did have them, they always seemed to elbow their way onto center stage. Has it been a simple matter of mathematics? That is, have there been more creatures in my orbit than in other people's? Or do I merely notice them more and draw them a little closer than someone else might? there has certainly been an element of serendipity. I seem to have a higher than average tendency to find animals in my path. In 1986, when I was relocating to Manhattan, I resigned myself to what I assumed would be a life with very little animal adjacency, except for the occasional dog or two. The day I moved into my new apartment, I unpacked a few boxes and then decided to go outside for some air. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I collided with a man who was walking a pet rabbit on a silver leash. I spun to a stop, flabbergasted. The man didn't register my surprise. He was too busy trying to manage the rabbit, which was huge, coffee-colored, and ornery. Each time the man took a step, the rabbit braced against the leash, stretching it taut, and only then, with a cold look in its eye, would it give a flabby, half-hearted hop. "Please, Rover, please," the rabbit's owner called out in an aching, exasperated voice. "Now that's a good Rover. Come on, boy, hop." A little more from that section. The art critic and philosopher John Berger once said, "We like to look at animals because they remind us of the past, and particularly of the agrarian life we used to lead that included the regular presence of animals." I agree, but I also think we look at animals because they're funny and companionable and interesting. Some of my animals have jobs. My chickens lay eggs. My dog scares the FedEx man. The cats, by their arrogant disregard of duty, serve to remind me that I have to schedule Terminix to come and chase the mice out of the basement. All of these creatures serve a purpose, even if that purpose is to have no real purpose other than to give a warm, wonderful, unpredictable texture to my life every day. I wouldn't have it any other way. So let me tell you a little bit about how this collection came about and how my writings that are in this collection came about. And first of all, I think it's worth noting that I've published two other collections, one that was a collection of profiles and one that was a collection of stories about place and places that were sort of central thematically. And I think there's a real pleasure in publishing a collection if, like me, you're somebody who writes really generally. That is my beat, is to have no beat. I get to choose what I write about, and my interests range so widely that sometimes it feels very random. And publishing collections has been a wonderful way to take that material and look at it thematically and see what I've returned to as a topic over and over again. And there was no question that I've written about animals really ever since I've begun as a writer. I think it occurred to me during the pandemic, and I think our attention turned to animals in a really particular way. You know, there was a crazy run on shelter dogs during the pandemic. At a time of great anxiety, everybody seemed to want a puppy. In fact, I got a puppy during the pandemic. I already had a dog, and I was seized with this absolutely almost irresistible desire to get another dog. Maybe it's because dogs are comforting, and it was in the middle of a moment where nothing felt comforting. And I was not the only one I knew. I would say half of my friends got dogs during COVID. Getting a puppy kind of reminded me of how central animals are to our lives. It wasn't a very far leap to me to begin thinking about how many stories I've written over the years that have at the center of them animals. Interestingly, the most recent story I did for the New Yorker, which I did during COVID, was an animal story. And it was about this virus outbreak that was roaring through the world's rabbit population and devastating rabbits globally. And this was a virus that began in China. And a lot of the strange sort of progress of the disease was exactly like COVID. And it was a story I couldn't resist. And I suppose part of what it brought to mind was just how often the animal world and the human world are in parallel. It did not take long till I pulled together an entire book's worth of stories, because this topic is one that I've returned to so often. What I wonder about is, how did this happen? I mean, to begin with, it's a very simple reason, which is I like animals. And so I think about them. And when I hear anything having to do with an animal, I think my antenna sort of begin swirling in excitement, because I imagine it's an interesting story. I'm curious about animals. It's not just that I enjoy them, that I love having a dog, that I liked having chickens, but I'm curious about that liminal space where we occupy the same world that animals do. Animals, to me, satisfy the urge we all have to meet a Martian. They have their own language, they have their own customs, their own traditions. We kind of understand them, but they remain mysterious. And that's what I imagine meeting a Martian would be like. And it's certainly the way it feels to interact with animals. Part of what makes them so intriguing is they're at the same time familiar and mysterious. We can't intersect with them in the way that we normally do with other people, namely through language. Even if you don't consider yourself an animal lover, you are living in a world populated with animals, and in which you for sure are intersecting with them, whether it's merely the rabbit that's eating your flowers in your garden, whether it's the drugs you take that were tested on animals. There are so many ways that humans intersect with animals consciously and unconsciously. And it's something that's really wired into who we are. I found it really fascinating when I learned that one of the diagnoses for a disordered mind is the inability to feel empathy toward animals. And this isn't to say that if you don't want a dog, you have a disordered mind. What it means is that it's a basic human impulse to feel empathy for these creatures that are, in the grand narrative of life, subordinate to us, and in an inability to feel some emotion toward them, or particularly a sense of concern if they're suffering, is a sign of something deeply wrong with someone's emotional makeup. And I always like to cite the example of one of my very favorite movies, Blade Runner. And in Blade Runner, the test to determine whether someone was a real human or a replicant was to see if they reacted when an animal was suffering. And it was the giveaway. It was almost impossible otherwise to tell if the difference between a real human and a replicant, except that one fact that a replicant wouldn't respond to an animal suffering. And I thought that was sort of a brilliant instance of showing us how fundamental that feeling is and how complicated it is. It's a feeling that isn't simple and isn't unilateral. It's complicated. Our feelings about animals are complicated. So where do these stories come from? In this book, I write about many different species. I write about dogs and cats, tigers and lions, bears, donkeys, whales. The stories obviously come from a huge range of sources. And stories for me are, well, there's a quality that's both wonderful because at the New Yorker, where most of these stories are from and where I've been writing for a very long time, we're expected to come up with our own story ideas. So nobody comes to me and assigns me a story about taxidermy. It's something that I cook up my own story ideas. And where do they come from? They come from an overheard conversation, a little notice in a newspaper, something that I see hanging on a bulletin board. They come truly through serendipity. And one of the kind of terrifying aspects of that is it's very hard to conjure an idea. Every time I finish a story, I am filled with this terror that that's it. I will never come up with another story idea because the way I found the story that I've just finished is so accidental. And they have really been accidental. For instance, to go back to the story that I mentioned about this rabbit virus, it's called rabbit hemorrhagic disease, that I wrote about. This came about absolutely accidentally. My stepson has a pet rabbit, and I have to say, I'm not a rabbit person. I've never thought much about rabbits. I've never had a rabbit. I guess I think they're cute, but I don't think about rabbits a lot. My stepson mentioned to me one day in passing that his rabbit's nails were a little overgrown because his vet clinic, which treats rabbits, was shut down. And I said, really? Why was it shut down? He said, well, there's some sort of viral outbreak. Now, in the middle of COVID, you hear the word viral. And I perked up and I said, what is it, COVID? What is it? He said, no, I don't know what it is. It's some kind of rabbit disease. Well, to me, that was the beginning of a story idea and a really irresistible story idea to learn about not only this particular disease, but the arc of how it was traveling around the world, and also to learn about the history of rabbit keeping and the rather strange relationship we have to rabbits, namely that they're the only animals that we are as likely to keep as pets as we are to eat. And we don't have that relationship with any other animal. So it was fascinating. And of course, it was also an allegory about COVID because of some of the mismanagement of the vaccine that's available for rabbits. And even in the rabbit world, there are anti-vaxxers, just because such a thing exists. So let me tell you a little bit about where some of these other stories came from, because I think it illustrates a lot about the book to see the texture of where these stories emerge. And to me, it's an example of how the animal world is around us all the time. So one of the stories, called Animal Action, came about because one day I was at a movie, and for whatever reason, we stuck around and watched all of the credits roll. and one after another. And finally, at the end was the very familiar slogan, "No animals were harmed." And suddenly I thought, well, that's interesting. I've never thought about it before, but who is guaranteeing that no animals were harmed? I mean, how did this slogan get applied to this film? So it struck me that this was a story, and I immediately tracked down, and I'm going to read a short bit from that story. I tracked down the people who issue that seal of approval for films, which is the American Humane Film and Television Unit, and they oversee any film you see that has that slogan at the end has had a representative from American Humane on set, making sure all the animals have been cared for according to their guidelines. So I'm just going to read to you a short bit from that story. And it was really fun to do. And again, really interesting because it drew me into an unexpected piece of history, which was the entire story of animals in Hollywood and the ups and downs of how they've been cared for, which is in itself a fascinating history. So this is from that story. It's called Animal Action. According to the American Humane Guidelines, no animal actor should have to work like a dog. For instance, if an ape is on a movie set for more than 3 consecutive days, the production must provide a play area or a private park where the ape can exercise and relax. When a bear is working on a film, anything that produces smells that might bother the bear, such as cheap perfume, strong liquor, or jelly donuts, must be removed from the location. Only cats that get along with dogs can be cast in cat and dog movies. No individual fish can be required to do more than 3 takes in a day. Also, under no circumstances can an animal cast member be squished. This rule applies to all non-human actors, including cockroaches. Karen Rosa, the director of American Humane's Film and Television Unit, was discussing this particular guideline one day last summer. If you show up on set with 25,000 cockroaches, you better leave with 25,000 cockroaches, she said. I wondered if she extended the same welcome to cockroaches at home. She shook her head. A cockroach in my kitchen is one thing, she said. A cockroach in a movie is an actor. Like any other actor, it deserves to go home at the end of the day. Let me tell you about a few more stories and their origins. And I see we've got a fair number of questions, so I'll begin answering questions so that I have time to answer all of them. And I think part of the reason I love talking about where the stories come from is just because it may seem like I'm, the story of Snow White where there, or is it Cinderella, where bluebirds are floating around her all the time and rabbits and deer are in her path. I don't think that's really been the case. I think animals are around us and in our lives all the time, and I just happen to notice them. I wrote a story in the book called Little Wing about a 12-year-old girl who raises racing pigeons. This came about in the most organic way possible. I was in a park walking my dog. I saw a young girl who was walking her dog, and it was an Australian Shepherd, and the dog was herding the pigeons in the park. And I started chatting with her, and I said, your dog must get frustrated when you're at home because he doesn't have any pigeons to herd. And she said, well, no, I have pigeons at home, so he can herd them at home. And I said to her, what do you mean you have pigeons at home? she said, well, I raise homing pigeons and I race them. And my jaw dropped, because even though I knew people raced homing pigeons, the majority of the people I knew who raised homing pigeons were 80-year-old Italian men. So it was quite surprising to meet a 12-year-old girl who had embraced the sport that was so not in her demographic. And it became a wonderful story that had a lot of poignancy, because at the moment that I met her, her family was about to move. And one of the things I learned very quickly is homing pigeons really do have one home. And if you move, you can't take them. Or rather, if you take them and let them fly, they'll fly back to their old home. Unlike Americans who move every 5 years, homing pigeons don't move. So she was in the middle of this very poignant experience of having to figure out what to do with these birds when she and her family moved to their new home. One of the stories that ended up being eerily prescient that I wrote, it's called The Lady and the Tigers. And this was many years before the Tiger King. And I just happened to hear on a news, I think a radio news show, that a tiger was seen walking through a suburb in New Jersey. And the tiger walked through town for the day. And unfortunately, he did not respond to the tranquilizer darts. And eventually he was killed because he was circling an elementary school. And that in itself is interesting. But what was even more interesting to me was that no one could figure out who the tiger belonged to. And you would think that in a suburb of Trenton, New Jersey, you would have a very short list of people who have tigers. And this turned into an incredibly weird story about a woman who had 27 tigers in her backyard in this suburban town. Nobody realized it. And she actually had lost track of how many tigers she had. She claimed that this tiger that was walking through town was not hers. And to this day, we don't know whose tiger it was, but it was an incredible story about animal hoarding, about the passion for keeping exotic animals to their great and undying unhappiness, I'll say. And it was an incredible reporting opportunity for me. And as I said, one of the frustrating things about writing about animals is you can't talk to them. But in the case of the tiger lady, she refused to talk to me. So it's not always the people that won't talk to you, or rather, it's not always the animals that won't talk to you. It's often the people as well. Probably the most fun story I had was profiling a show dog. And like a lot of writers, I cut my teeth in journalism doing a lot of celebrity profiles. And they are very much a sort of set form. You spend time with the celebrity where their handler and their manager and their agent are always making sure the celebrity doesn't reveal too much. And you describe them looking beautiful and being fit and eating healthy foods. And around the time of the Westminster Dog Show, I became really curious about whether a show dog lives the life of a dog during its off time, or whether it's always living as a supermodel and worrying about its weight and its hair and its nails. And I decided to take the template of a celebrity profile and apply it to a show dog. And I wrote a profile. It was actually a story that I really enjoyed doing, a profile of the dog that everyone thought would win Westminster that year. And he did live a life that was very much the life of a supermodel. And I fell in love with him. He was an incredibly beautiful dog. Just going to read a very brief bit from that story, and then I'm going to start taking your questions. So if anybody else wants to throw a question in there, please do. So this is from the profile, and it's called Show Dog. If I were a bitch, I'd be in love with Biff Truesdale. Biff is perfect. He's friendly, good looking, rich, famous, and in excellent physical condition. He almost never drools. He's not afraid of commitment. He wants children. Actually, he already has children and wants a lot more. He works hard and is a consummate professional, but he also knows how to have fun. What Biff likes most is food and sex. This makes him sound boorish, but he's not. He's just elemental. Food he likes even better than sex. His favorite things to eat are cookies, mints, and hotel soap, but he will eat just about anything. Richard Krieger, a friend of Biff's who occasionally drives him to appointments, said not long ago, when we're driving on I-95, we'll usually pull over at McDonald's. Even if Biff is napping, he always wakes up when we're getting close. I get him a few plain hamburgers with buns, no ketchup, no mustard, no pickles. He loves hamburgers. I don't get him his own French fries, but if I get myself fries, I always flip a few for him into the back. If you're ever around Biff while you're eating something he wants to taste, cold roast beef, a Wheatables cracker, chocolate, pasta, aspirin, whatever, he will stare at you across the pleated bridge of his nose and let his eyes sag and his lips tremble and allow a little bead of drool to percolate at the edge of his mouth until you feel so crummy that you give him a taste. I am going to open it up to questions here, and hold on one second. And you can keep submitting questions, and we will answer as many as I have time for. Someone anonymously says, we got a puppy during the pandemic too. How do you think acquiring a puppy during a time of crisis, global or personal, changes your view of the crisis? Well, it's a great question. And I think for a lot of people, it was the desire to have some concrete, actionable task that a dog presents. I mean, some people got puppies during the pandemic because they were home and they thought this is an ideal time to get a puppy because I'm home and I can take care of the puppy. But I think for a lot of people, it presented a chance to go from the overwhelming and truly insurmountably baffling nature of the crisis to something really specific and concrete. I mean, I got very distracted by the challenge of housebreaking my new puppy at a time when previously all I could think about was COVID. So I think that it gives people something immediate that it can be a salve at a time when the world feels unmanageable. Another anonymous person says, you're one of my favorite Twitter follows. Thank you. Has social media always come easily to you, or did you have to warm up to sharing? Either way, I'm glad you're there. Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. You know, I got onto Twitter a million years ago when Twitter was very new and I was living up in the country. And I loved being up there, but my day-to-day life was devoid of any ambient social experience. I mean, I had lots of friends, but they were all far enough away that it wasn't easy for me to take a break. I was in the middle of writing a book and I couldn't take 2 hours out of my day. And if I had 10 minutes or 15 minutes, no one lived close enough to me for me to just grab a quick cup of coffee. So I got onto Twitter and I reacted to it like, oh, here's my office where I can shoot the breeze for a few minutes. And it felt really natural. And I was very unselfconscious about it. And I didn't think, gee, I'm a writer, so I have to write really carefully. And I didn't do it with any real anxiety. I just thought, oh, I get to chit chat with people and read a little bit of what other people are saying and say that, my head hurts or I had a crummy lunch or whatever was on my mind at the moment. So it did really come easily to me, perhaps too easily. Maybe that's not a good sign, but it felt very natural. And I feel lucky because I enjoy it. I wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it. And I enjoy it because it feels easy to do. Someone else anonymously says, how many animals is too many? Oh, God. Well, I'm not in a position to say because having at times had too many animals, well, no, I don't feel I had too many animals. I had a lot of animals. I had about 20 chickens, 2 geese, 2 ducks, 4 guinea fowl, 4 turkeys, 10 Black Angus cattle, a dog, and 3 cats. And actually, that was probably enough. I mean, I really wanted a donkey. I wanted a horse. But I knew at that point that I was maybe at maximum animal. I think obviously too many animals is when you begin acquiring animals merely to acquire them. And that's when I know you're joking, but I wrote enough about animal hoarders to find the topic really disturbing. And unfortunately, animal hoarders are not people who take good care of animals. So it's a pretty grim place to go. And I do think most people know when they have enough animals. I now have enough animals. I have 2 dogs and a cat, and it's enough. And sometimes it's too much, actually. Lisa Almond, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Curious how much research you do before you pitch the story. That's a great question. I don't generally do any research before I pitch the story. Usually what happens is an idea of, a little glimmer catches my eye. And I'll give you an example, going back to the story about the film and television unit of American Humane. I made the inquiry just to know who did issue that no animals were harmed. And I got the barest information about the fact that they have representatives on film sets. And I almost didn't want to know more. I didn't need to know more. I felt like I knew it was a great story. And I went to the New Yorker and said, I want to do this. And I sense for sure that it's a great story. It is not impossible if you do what I just described, that you'll get into a story and after you've done a little bit of research, realize that it's not as good a story as you had hoped it was. But luckily, that hasn't happened to me very often. And the few times that it has, I realized it pretty quickly. But generally, I'm so excited about an idea that I am going full speed ahead right off the bat. Anonymous attendee says, you mentioned with rabbits, we're as likely to have them as pets as to eat them. As someone who feels connected to animals, what's your take on eating animals generally? I think it's a really personal matter. And I see the argument for being a vegetarian and I absolutely see the argument for becoming vigilant on eating animals that you feel pretty sure were raised in a humane way. And certainly since I've had chickens and raised them and really grew to love them, I would never buy eggs that were not cage free, because I know what chickens are like, and I know what factory farming of chickens is like, and it's terrible. And we don't need to do factory farming the way it's been done. So, I think that there's a spectrum of how you respond to the idea of eating animals, and wherever you're comfortable on that spectrum, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are moral choices wherever you land on that spectrum. Did you watch Tiger King over the pandemic? I didn't, and I'll tell you why. I having written this story and having pretty strong feelings after I wrote the story about this woman in New Jersey, I found even the sight of tigers being kept in those conditions really unpleasant. And also I had some real, I was uncomfortable with some elements of the way the show was made. I watched the first episode and then I thought, I don't want to see this. So, it was a combination, though definitely for me, it was having written about the subject and feeling as strongly as I did about people keeping exotic animals, which there is no excuse for it. So it was very disturbing to me. Someone says, what's the most heartbreaking animal story or otherwise you wrote about? Well, I mean, I will say that the Tiger Lady story was, I'm not sure if I could identify specifically the most heartbreaking, but the realization of the exotic animal economy. And by that, I mean the fact of overbreeding exotic animals and having nowhere for them to be properly living their lives was really disturbing. And it was a journey into the backstory of even the very best zoos in this country. And it changed me. And it was heartbreaking, and it really brought me to the position that I'd begun feeling, which is that I really do oppose captivity, and I hope we are moving toward a future where we don't keep animals in captivity. Laura Weiss asks, I understand that many people have adopted animals during the pandemic. There's been a growing percentage of those adopted animals being returned to the shelter to the point they're running out of room. Have you heard about this sad trend? I just read about it for the first time. And I don't know how documented this is. And that the reason that I'm hesitating is because there was also some misinformation about the number of animals being adopted. So I do think that there's no question that a lot of people said, I'm home, I'm lonely, I want a puppy, without thinking about it. And the fact is, as a person who's had dogs since I was in college, which was a really dumb thing to do, but I've had dogs since then. Dogs are a huge responsibility, and people often forget that. And I think a lot of people rushed to adopt without thinking, and maybe at this point in time, because they're working at home, that's made it more possible for them. But the reality is dogs are a handful, and they're also expensive. And there may have been a lot of people who later thought, what was I thinking? The responsible thing, obviously, is to return them to the shelter. And I think that we increasingly are adopting animals at shelters as opposed to buying them from breeders. So I'm hopeful that for every animal that's returned, there's someone who's in a better position to really have a pet who's adopting it. What do you think of the recent experiment and potential practice of sacrificing pigs to harvest their kidneys to save human lives? I saw that story, and I'm not sure, and I don't want to answer this without really knowing enough. I don't know if the pigs were sacrificed, by which I assume you mean killed, or whether they had one kidney removed the way people donate kidneys. I don't know, and I don't want to pass judgment on something that I'm not sure about. And again, this is why writing about animals and thinking about animals is so intriguing, because the question is, if we look at a person who needs a kidney transplant and they're going to die, or a pig could be sacrificed for them to have a kidney, what is our moral position on that? And I'm not going to say that I know what the moral position is. And I'm not sure I know what my position is. So I'm not trying to evade the question. I'm just saying I feel like that's really complicated, and that is why thinking about animals and writing about animals is fascinating, because it's not a simple answer. If you've seen Never Let Me Go, the Kazuo Ishiguro story, where people are raised to be harvested for their organs, and this is the most dystopian idea imaginable, then you've got this in between where animals are sacrificed to save people. And then in the case of the story I wrote about the rabbit virus, the vaccine that can protect rabbits from this virus is made by killing rabbits. So, and there were a number of people that decided not to vaccinate their rabbit because they didn't feel comfortable with the idea of a rabbit dying for their rabbit to be protected from this virus. And just to explain, it's not a one-to-one. A rabbit is infected with rabbit hemorrhagic disease, and when it dies, its liver is used to produce, according to the company that makes the vaccine, it makes several thousand doses. So what's the moral position that one should take? Should you get your rabbit vaccinated against a deadly disease if a rabbit died to make the vaccine? These are the questions that are the nature of morality. And I think we've come to understand that morality extends beyond the human species, and then it gets complicated. The number of people who I know who have been relieved when a beloved pet died of natural causes quickly, and there were no moral questions raised about how much money to spend to protect the animal. And instead, the natural course of things kind of absolved the owner of having to make a tough decision, because we aren't sure where on the grand scheme of things the value of animal life should be. And there was this book is not a treatise on morality or ethical, issues around animals, but each story embodied that question of how do we live with these other beings? What do we owe them? What do they deserve in terms of their lives? How do we share a planet with them? And what does that look like? And to me, it's a subject that is endlessly interesting and rich and complex. Before we go, because I think we're running out of time, which is too bad because these were great questions, and I think I got them all. I'm just going to read one last bit from the end of the book. And just to give you an idea, the book begins and ends with sections that are very first person about my living with animals. And then in between are the 15 essays that are reported pieces about other animals, and that are more journalistic rather than these first person pieces. So this is about my farm in the Hudson Valley of New York. And as my time there was drawing to a close, figuring out what I was going to do, in this case with my chickens. One day, the young woman who cleaned our house mentioned that she was about to have a baby. I was astonished. She was as slight as a twig. I asked her the particulars. Any day now, she explained, the eggs would crack. Aha, I didn't know she had chickens, thus the confusion. She wanted more babies, she added, but her rooster was getting very old. I have a rooster, I said, pointing out to the coop, and he's going to need a home. And thus the deal was struck. Maria would welcome my 3 hens and my very fertile rooster to her home at the end of the summer, relieving me of all the worry about where I would dispatch them. I made some noise about maybe borrowing them back the next summer, but I didn't want to complicate things too much. As it turned out, that was a good thing. We loved our house in the Hudson Valley more than anything, but getting there from Los Angeles was starting to feel exhausting, especially because we didn't like to put our pets on a plane. Every summer, my husband had to drive across country to ferry the dog and the cat to New York. Then we added a puppy, so John had to drive a dog, a puppy, and a cat. COVID was the final straw. We listed the Hudson Valley house and sold it to the first people who saw it. Our chapter there was done. We went to the farm one last time to clear it out for the new owners. It was a hard goodbye. I'd always dreamed that someday I would have animals all around me, in the house, in the yard, watching me in the garden, dotting the landscape, crowing in the morning, lowing in the moonlight, barking at the wind. And I had had that there. I had reveled in the animals' friendship and their strangeness, the way they were so obvious and still so mysterious, their colors and textures, their fur and feathers, the sounds and smells of their presence. I liked the way their needs set the rhythm of every day, and how caring for them felt elemental and essential. Living among them as I had on the farm was just as satisfying as I imagined it would be. When the house was emptied, I took one last walk around. As I made my way through the trees and across the fields and down to where the coop had been, I collected a few things that could remind me of the farm forever, and perhaps betoken some place in my future that would feel the way it had. A piece of quartz, a pine cone, a knob of moss, and one perfect chicken feather. Thank you again for joining me tonight.
I wish we had more time. I am also a Twitter follower of yours, and I couldn't agree more that I often find your posts laugh out loud funny. So thank you for taking the time to do that. I do wish we had more time because I could listen to you talk and read for longer. But I want to thank you for being here, Susan Orlean. As a gentle reminder to everybody out there in the audience, I've posted the book link to On Animals in the chat. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website. While you're there, after checking out the book, I hope you'll also check out our events page. We would love to see you at another event soon. In the meantime, well, actually, we have a couple minutes. May I just ask one bonus question before we go? What's on your bedside table? What are you reading now? What should we? What can you recommend?
I just started Trust Exercise by Susan Choi.
Okay.
And I am rereading The Association of Small Bombs by Karen Maharan.
Okay.
And which is a fantastic book.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, two great recommendations for us to check out as well. Thanks again, everybody. We hope to see you soon. In the meantime, stay well and stay well read. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Great event.